And today I bring Dr. Richard Sadler from Michigan State University to talk to us. He's the third person in the winter seminar series. We're super excited to have him. But before he speaks, I want to give a short introduction to him, about him to you guys. Dr. Sadler is currently Associate Professor of Geography in the Division of Public Health, Department of Family Medicine, College of Human Medicine at Michigan State University. Rick and I go way back. I think we met in 2012 on our campus, University of Michigan-Flint, talking to other faculty. And then since then, we bumped into each other several times in Flint when I used to live in the city of Flint. Dr. Sadler received his Bachelor of Science from the University of Michigan-Flint in the Department of Earth and Resource Science, which became the Department of Geography Geography, Planning, and Environment in 2007. He then didn't go far away. He got his PhD from Western Ontario University in the Department of Geography. And then recently, he obtained a Master of Public Health from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. No big deal, of course. His research is really impressive. It covers many areas, including environmental science, GIS, food systems planning, and then land use policy and legacy cities. Much of his research is focused on Flint and other urban areas in the Midwest. He has at least 62 peer-reviewed publications that I could count. His publications have been cited over 1,800 times. Besides his commitment to making Flint a better place, he is a strong supporter of the local hockey team, the Flint Firebirds. We've had several conversations about hockey throughout our relationship. He's also in a new popular local ska band, which I hope to see sometime soon. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rick Sadler to our seminar series this winter semester at the University of Michigan-Flint. Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. And yeah, I actually see our backup bassist on the call here today. Tom Hutchison is the director of Habitat for Humanity and also a bassist. So maybe you'll see him out as well. So thanks everybody for calling in today. That was a long introduction to, well, to me, and I guess just to kind of simplify it, I am a dude who makes maps, very similar to Greg, in fact. And so that's part of why we've had so much interaction over the years, I think, is that we just share a lot of this, the same kind of interests. And while I get this up, there we go. And that's coming through okay. Cool. Yeah, so I'm a Flint native. As Greg said, I went to UM-Flint. And so it's nice to be back here talking with folks at UM-Flint. So what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of a whole gob of research that connects, in particular, mental health to the built environment. And so I'm going to try to be broad enough that if it's not really your jam, that this kind of makes sense, but also go in deep enough into some of the research projects I've done that you get a glimpse of how to do this kind of research if you're a researcher yourself or if you're interested in research. And I wanted to share a couple of stock photos of myself from the end of my years in undergrad. And in fact, my academic mentor was Ed Chow, who was Greg's direct predecessor. So when Ed left for Texas State, Greg came in. So that was also part of the connection. It was like I was in grad school at the time. And I was like, oh, this is the new Ed Chow. So I'm just going to go introduce myself. So that's how Greg and I got acquainted. All right, so I'm not going to belabor this, but I will add, during the end of my grad school years, I was kind of back and forth between Flint and London, Ontario a lot. So I got connected to a number of community entities, the land bank, the health department, the city of Flint planning department. And in every sense, I was the map dude, right? All of these entities had GIS needs, and being a product of the UM-Flint geography department, effectively, having learned GIS there, that was my tool, my skill, right? Like I always think, well, if academia never doesn't work out, I can go work in a city planning department. But so I was always really grateful that UM-Flint gave me that tangible skill that I could take anywhere. But so I got connected to a number of entities, and when MSU So yeah, so I have that weird long title. I'm a geographer, I'm in public health, I'm in family medicine, and all of that is kind of necessary because MSU expanded a research division here, starting in the end of 2014, start of 2015. And so we were not yet a department. We're just about to become a department of public health. But for the last 7 years, we've been a division, so just kind of a slice of the College of Human Medicine, and they just kind of throw our tenure homes on main campus somewhere. So we have a bit of interaction with main campus, but we're really our own thing. And I'm in the building that's next to the farmers market, just a block down from UM-Flint. So that's where I am today, and where I've been the last 7 years. And yeah, I hope, especially if you're not familiar with kind of the connections among environmental science and geography with public health, that what I'm sharing today will help kind of smooth out those links. So yeah, so throughout all my work, my central goal has really been calling attention to disparities and injustices. If you know me, you know that I hate injustice, and I don't realize that's a strong word, but I feel like hating things that are hateful is kind of like the opposite, right? So I like justice, I guess I could say, to be more positive. So I'm going to be talking about weathering. I'm not going to like dig too deep into any kind of theoretical basis of that. But if you think about weathering, like rocks being weathered, right? The rain hits them and the wind and atmosphere, and they break down over time. So there's this idea of weathering among humans as well. And so I'm going to dive into kind of how I've started approaching that concept more and more. Then I'm going to show a few examples of how my work has integrated that thinking into the study of mental health disparities, but also with respect to the environments that cause that weathering, and how structural racism is a real clear underlying element of all of that. And I'll talk about how I took that direction because it's what my colleagues studied. So an alternative title to this talk could have been like a Motown band, Rick Sadler and the Psychologists, because psychologists are probably the one discipline I work the most with, aside from, I do a lot of work with geographers still because it's nice to be home and work with other geographers too. So yeah, I'll share a few upcoming projects and where that leaves us in the future. So a little bit of background. First, I'd like to open by sharing how, I think everybody on the call is either in Flint or in the region, so we know about urban decline. We know it's a thing that's beset American cities throughout the late 20th century. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page, when I'm talking about decline, I'm talking about how population has physically declined. There's fewer people in our cities. Our cities were beset by crime, unemployment, drug use, all kinds of things that made the city less appealing, and it was this reinforcing pattern, right? And in Michigan in particular, we have the way that land use law works, the way that cities and townships and villages are all fragmented and pay separate tax bases, and how easy it is to move from one to the other. It means that our city centers wind up underfinanced. They have huge infrastructures. They don't have the money to manage those. They don't even have the resources a lot of times to think about how to manage smaller populations. So they're just stuck with this massive infrastructure, and there's not a lot of room to deal with the problems associated with that. So the infrastructure deteriorates, right? And that's very much what we saw in the case of the Flint water crisis. It was a water infrastructure system that was falling apart, that had a crisis thrust upon it that pushed it into what it became. So I'm not going to talk too much about these, but I want to bring up these big words: deindustrialization. So all neoliberalism, globalization, and racist housing practices all contributed uniquely to urban decline. And I think that's important to discuss, because sometimes we can, or at least in non-academic circles, we might tend to think of like, oh, well, Flint brought it on itself, or the people who live there, blah, 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 like very much victim blaming. But there's these patterns, right? We, as a country, stopped making as much stuff in the 70s and 80s. So that's deindustrialization. There's not as many factories as there used to be. So it changes the employment pattern. Neoliberalism is the government philosophy where government backs off and kind of gives control more to businesses. And so that happening at the same time as there's this economic shift was hugely upsetting for American society. And so the whole pattern of what happened in cities in the 70s and 80s is very much connected to those issues. And of course, globalization is connected to deindustrialization in that a lot of factory jobs went to other countries, and we have this much more global economy than we had 100 or 200 years ago. It's not just international trade and colonialism, but it's a much more integrated connection between countries. So I like talking about all of those because those are kind of the base things. Those are things maybe that are more present in society. But I also increasingly have taken an interest to racist housing practices, because we can't discount the effect that, like a lot of other countries, have dealt with deindustrialization, have had regimes built around neoliberalism and shrinking the government side of things and letting business kind of take over. But not every country has had segregation and racism in housing the way that we have in the US. So that's why I really focus on that element in my work. Keeping all that in mind, I also explore how urban decline, or I want to explore here how urban decline generates these indirect environmental injustices as well. So there's the more direct where people live next to polluting industries or next to polluted rivers or what have you. But this decline also generates higher rates of vacant properties, disordered environments like dumping sites, burned out cars, burned out houses, higher crime rates, poorer public safety provision. And again, all of these things feed on each other and can make a community worse or cause a community to have to spend a lot of attention on these instead of being able to spend attention on park beautification or youth programs or what have you. So communities like us here in Flint have to deal with a whole host of different issues that communities elsewhere in the US and around the world don't have to deal with. I'm not saying other communities don't have these issues, but ours is kind of magnified in a way that there's not a lot of other cities in the US that experience this cluster of issues quite the same. So recognizing these connections and being in a research heavy position here at MSU over the last 7 years, I've been able to spend a lot of time pursuing this general interest around, hey, the built environment seems like it's pretty screwed up. It seems like there's these historical impacts that are driving kind of the evolution of the environment. Let's dive in. So some of the work I did while I was still in grad school and kind of into the start of my time was a project with a colleague who's at Michigan Tech now. And we were looking at racist housing practices in Flint. So I'm going to get more into what I mean exactly by those in a few. But what we were looking at in this case was basically white flight, neighborhoods that had been systematically abandoned by the white population at some point in the 70s or 80s. And so what we did is we used a tool called geographically weighted regression and looked for basically the strongest predictors of housing condition change. And what we found was the increase in vacancy rates precipitated by white flight, that's these dark gray shadings, were the strongest predictors of how a neighborhood changed, more than an increase in poverty, more than the demographic change itself. And we overlaid these outlines, are neighborhoods that changed by basically more than half of the white population left them within a decade. So all that to say, the finding of this paper, the key finding was that white flight and blockbusting and massive abandonment from the city before General Motors ever pulled out, before there was any economic change, was much more strongly responsible for the way that Flint declined. So it's trying to change that narrative from the purely economic explanation for Flint's decline into a social explanation by way of the property abandonment that was experienced during the era of white flight. And it really created this self-fulfilling prophecy of decline where things were fine. And then as neighborhoods started to integrate, a lot of white families panicked, moved out of the city, and way more people moved out than were moving into these neighborhoods. So it created an abandonment issue. I've also been a part of a couple grants that I wanted to highlight because they kind of keep adding to this piece inside my mind about health disparities. So I was a part of this big grant that two colleagues of mine wrote, in fact, with a number of community partners. And it was an NIH funded project called the Flint Center for Health Equity Solutions. We had a couple of different intervention projects, and I helped run a piece of that overarching project that helped manage the data and set up like data policies and kind of the nerd stuff, I guess you could say. But we also did a project with our community partners where on both of these physical health and mental health interventions, where we asked them to describe the kinds of geographic variables that might influence health behavior change. And so we had a whole bunch of GIS variables that we were going to add together to get this cool map, but we had them give their insights on the actual, the weights to use. And that's actually a technique I learned while in undergrad at UM-Flint that Ed Chow taught me. And I published using that method 3 times now, I think. So the result of the method was a healthfulness index that gave us a view into relatively more or less health promoting neighborhoods in Flint. And in fact, these projects are just now wrapping up. And so what we want to do next is combine these healthfulness index maps with the addresses of individuals from these interventions to see if living in a more health promoting neighborhood made it easier to change behavior for the better compared to if you live in a less health promoting neighborhood. So it's all around kind of advocating for equity in neighborhood redevelopment. The first NIH grant that I got as the principal investigator of, as the head of, is the CHARD. So that's Characterizing Housing, Alcohol, and Racial Disparities grant. And this project was getting back into that, the whole racist housing practices literature, right? But with an angle toward looking at how alcohol landscapes evolved over time. So these little tiny maps on the bottom are the locations of alcohol outlets, so liquor stores, bars, restaurants, grocery stores that sell alcohol over time from 1950 through to 2000, going left to right. And so what you see is kind of emblematic of what you see with a lot of businesses and population in Flint. There's a big cluster in the middle of the city, and it kind of gets weeded out over time and spreads out and disperses. We could have predicted that, but what we didn't know is how does the alcohol landscape change over time? Was it more or less inequitable back in the 1950s and 60s versus today? So like when racism in housing was legal and allowed versus today when it's technically not, but the city of Flint is a very different place. So for example, one thing we found from that is that the alcohol landscape is actually a little bit less inequitable today than it was back in the 50s. And that's in part because of the way segregation in Flint concentrated the African-American population in just a couple of neighborhoods with lots of shop bars and little stores and so forth all around them, compared to today where while the city is still fairly segregated, it's much more dispersed and there's not quite as much concentration of liquor stores. But there's still an inequality overall. It's just decreased over time. So this grant was a means for me to start exploring more of those racist housing practices and building layers of what those practices are, which I'm going to get to very shortly. So just a little bit more about the weathering hypothesis. All this work revolves around the idea that living in neighborhoods with bad land uses, so liquor stores or polluting industries or what have you, or an absence of good things, right, like parks and schools and civic institutions, weighs down on people's livelihoods. So these neighborhoods exhibit disadvantage on residents in a number of ways, including earlier onset of chronic disease and impacts on birth outcomes. So all of these things have been found in weathered neighborhoods. But the thing is, a lot of how weathering has been, or disadvantage has been defined, is just based on contemporary socioeconomic status, or possibly a few layers, like, again, like alcohol outlets, food access, parks, like park equity, that kind of stuff. And so what I wanted to add to the weathering literature is, well, what about a neighborhood that was discriminated against for 60 years, where you couldn't get home loans, where minority populations were concentrated, where there was like systematic disinvestment by banks. So that's where a lot of this structural racism piece comes in. And I'll get to that in just one more slide. So I wanted to think about weathering's determinants, like what is it actually that causes weathering, like weathered neighborhoods. It's not just the presence of a poorer population, because there's something that caused the concentration of a poorer population in a neighborhood. So it's not just the population shifts or decline where people are moving from, but thinking about weathering as it's stemming from systematic disinvestment in cities. So that's where I kind of started blending these thoughts together, is that this really reflects structural racism in our society. When we can reconstruct these historical landscapes the way I did with the Chard, and we have this eye toward health equity the way I did in the FCHES grant, we can start basically adding more layers to the study of structural racism than we've had before, just adding a little bit more depth to it. Okay, so there's at least 7 different kinds of structural racism in the housing environment specifically. So I say built environment, but all of these refer to just basically discrimination in housing. And they're kind of chronological, but back before 1968, before fair housing, it was legal to discriminate. It was legal to, with restrictive covenants, say, if you don't look like us, if you're not the right race, i.e. if you're not white, you can't live in this neighborhood or this house. Similarly, but kind of along a different tack, redlining existed to basically make it impossible or very difficult to get home loans, home repair loans, mortgages of any kind in neighborhoods that banks and lenders had said were too risky for investment, i.e. every minority neighborhood in America practically, and then also a lot of poorer white neighborhoods, but almost 100% of like African-American neighborhoods, for example, were redlined. So if you lived there, you were either paying cash for your home, or you were renting, or you were buying on a land contract, which is a much more tenuous way to buy a home than getting a conventional mortgage. So basically started creating more inequalities in the environment over and above the inequalities that already existed in society. Of course, that contributed to segregation. Our cities are still very segregated by race and class, and the way that we build and zone and so forth is central to all of that. Then in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't legal anymore to discriminate based on race, but real estate agents would go around and scare white residents into selling. So it was literally blockbusting, because they'd go down a whole block and they'd tell every family in the block, if you don't sell your home in the next 6 months, you're going to lose 50% of the value. And so they provoked a lot of panic selling on economic lines, and then also, of course, on racial lines. And they'd appeal to people's latent or blatant racism to get them to move out of neighborhoods. That's kind of connected to racial steering. Will a real estate agent show you a home in a certain neighborhood? Will they say, oh, well, maybe you should live over here. Oh, no, that house isn't available anymore. And so that's a process that's ongoing, a little bit less geographical, so it's a little harder to map. But then a couple more patterns that are more contemporary: gentrification, of course, the reinvestment in cities and how that can be inequitable, displacing people. And then predatory lending, similar to, it's technically illegal, but it's basically preying on people, giving them subprime loans, making it easier to, basically increasing the chances that someone will default on a loan. So all of these things are either were legal or are legal or are still going on even though they're not legal. And I think that they overlap in different ways. There's not exactly a one-to-one concordance. So if we're talking about the way that discrimination in the housing environment or the built environment impacts people, you really need to distinguish among these different types. So that's kind of where all of this work is going. Okay, so stepping back one more step before I dive back in. I think about the built environment, including housing, but also transportation and cultural and social systems and everything in the water system, as a breeding ground of determinants for health. And it's not just the physical environment that directly impacts on health by way of pollution and exposures and so forth, but there's these underlying and legacy impacts that go back decades that create different types of conditions in different neighborhoods. And so my approach in all of this work, being a geographer, I collect or tap into existing data on health outcomes. And so for me, if we have addresses, that's perfect. If we have census tracts, we can work with that. Zip codes get a little funky because they're a little bit big and unwieldy. So ideally, I'm looking for the smallest geography possible. And then I do what's called geocoding. And so if we have home or work or school or some combination of those addresses, we can plot people where they exist, right? And home is common because we spend a lot of time at home, especially the last couple of years. So the impacts of the neighborhood around us are thought to impact on our behavior and health. So then we build up all these other data sets in our geographic information systems, which is our computer mapping system. And we link these data sets together with the survey data or the medical records, and then look for potential connections between them with statistical analysis. So the three of the first projects I've undertaken are connected insofar as they're all psychology colleagues. They all leverage existing data sets. So these three here, and they're all of these psychologists leverage the same kind of ecological model of health that people like me, i.e. health geographers, use. So if you're familiar with bioecological models of development or Bronfenbrenner, I'm not going to dive into that, but that's kind of the way that we situate ourselves. Basically, the idea that health is more than biology. There's all these other systems that interact together to influence health. So in the first project, and I'm pretty sure Greg has worked with the Speak to Your Health study as well. It's a big Flint area study that Dan Kruger at U of M Ann Arbor oversees, and it's still ongoing. But in this study, we used a couple older years worth of data, and we were looking at connections between poor mental health and hopelessness and well-being with changes in vacancy rates. So I had some historical data on, actually from the census, on like how much a neighborhood's vacancy rate had changed from one decade to the next, from like 1960 to 2010. And what we found is that more recent changes in vacancy, so more recently abandoned neighborhoods, like places that are undergoing change, residents in those neighborhoods tended to have poorer mental health, say, than even a neighborhood that was already high vacancy but was kind of chill, right? So we're seeing that it's like the change that can be upsetting to people's mental health. And of course, long-term vacancy changes and long-term vacancy, like living in a neighborhood with a 60% vacancy rate, can have impacts on mental health. But it's really those like recent changes that we were seeing were negative. So how does this connect to the structural racism side? Well, it could be that a neighborhood that experienced some kind of shock to the system by way of white flight, it might take a while for the impacts of that to be seen. So it's important to characterize when a neighborhood changes, how it changes, i.e. like who leaves, why they leave, and then what impacts that has on the neighborhood in the present day. And then this little diagram is just showing a finding that we had that even if you lived in a neighborhood with more vacancy, like even though that could impact your mental health, the more connected you were to your neighbors, so the higher level of social integration could buffer against that. So we're looking for, here in Flint, we're stuck with the situation we have, right? How can we make lemonade out of lemons, right? So being more connected to one's neighbors could help buffer that. So it's suggestive that if we support, neighborhood connection programs and social events and so forth, that could have a positive impact on people. Okay, going out east to a project called the Healthy Minds at Work study, we took basically a similar data set, and we were looking at similar data. So cohesion, collective efficacies, like feeling like you can work together, perceptions of how messy the neighborhood is, disorder, perceptions of violence and disadvantage and so forth. And so this is with a colleague at Johns Hopkins, we found that higher levels of violence and disadvantage, oddly, or interestingly, actually predicted higher levels of basically cognitive restructuring and problem-focused coping is like having a better attitude, a better perspective on how to deal with one's challenges. So it's kind of this perverse thing, right? Like we don't want neighborhoods to be disordered. We want to address those issues. And yet youth that were coming from neighborhoods like that were better able to grapple with life's challenges. And so again, we were finding that the relationships people had in those neighborhoods, having higher levels of social cohesion and collective efficacy, possibly because of neighborhood challenges, may be the necessary buffers that are making people better able to grapple with decline, right? With the effects of structural racism in the built environment. Swinging down to Alabama real quick, I enlisted a former colleague here at MSU who had been down at University of South Alabama to look at, again, like perceived disorder in childhood and objective like socioeconomic characteristics. So did you grow up in a poorer or a wealthier neighborhood? And consistent with that, with this project here, we actually found that neighborhood disadvantage was associated with lower current anxiety. So again, it's like this weird bucking of a potential trend you might see. So it raises important questions, I think, about the resilient environments. And there's a lot of talk about resilience in communities that have been like Flint, like here, that have been affected by structural racism. But it always raises that question to me, like, well, why do we have to make people be resilient? Why can't we just take away the conditions that cause them to have to be resilient in order to survive, right? But still, it is an interesting finding, because basically the kids that grew up in more disordered or higher poverty, higher crime neighborhoods tended to fare better with mental health in college. And so we don't super know why that is, but yeah, so all of these are kind of different avenues and different geographical locations where I'm inserting my perspective as a geographer, helping ask and answer different kinds of questions than these psychology colleagues would otherwise. So one more slide on this, the Healthy Minds at Work study. We're doing a follow-up paper. And in that paper, we looked at the same kinds of mental health conditions, but then also threw in some of those discriminatory or racist housing practices. And so we found a couple of kind of strange findings. One is that gentrification had a bigger negative impact on internalizing symptoms, so stress and anxiety among the young women in the study. So gentrification being that process of new investment in a community. And so we were thinking that something that might have been happening is, like, in gentrifying communities, it could be adding stress to young women because of the way that social networks are conveyed or broken up or what have you. But then inversely, young men living in blockbusted neighborhoods, so again, those are the neighborhoods that were systematically disinvested in by mostly white residents in the 70s and 80s. So a process that's like 40 years old. Those kinds of neighborhoods, boys were faring worse in, and had like less ability to form stronger social ties. So again, like all of these things are looking at different elements of how do we characterize the neighborhood environment with a little bit more nuance, and how does that connect to the way people interact with their neighborhoods. And so all of those papers, I wanted to try to get those people together. And of course, tragically, COVID hit in the start of 2020. So we did a session virtually, but the idea had been bring all these different psychologists together and take our show on the road to this Society for Prevention Research, which is a very different kind of group than the group that I would have seen myself working with. But they're looking at the etiology, the starting point of social, physical, and mental health conditions, and then trying to translate that information. So we were bringing all this geographical information to them to try to convey, hey, maybe you should think about the importance of environment and health. Okay, so a couple of key points from that. Really, it's to try to introduce the impacts of the built environment to new faces, right? To psychologists in this case, and those thinking about mental health impacts. In a lot of other studies, they may look at, they may throw zip code in as the singular geographic reference point, and then, kind of sort people according to that. And are certain zip codes more predictive of poorer mental health? But again, their zip codes are big. They don't have that same context. You can't get the same amount of geographic data into them, or the same granularity of geographic data. And so, yeah, so along the way, we learn like both individuals' perceptions of their neighborhood environment and objectively measured characteristics of the built environment can impact how people deal with stressors and what level of stress and anxiety they experience. But again, since we know there are these built-in injustices in urban environments, it provokes more inquiry into what causes these disparities in the built environment. So in other words, focusing even more on structural racism. So yeah, so circling back to some of these elements, it's what we're finding is there's not a lot of, like, there's some work on redlining. There's some work on, actually a lot more recent work on redlining. Redlining, again, being outlawed in 1968. And in some cases, cities are very unrecognizable from what they were in 1968. So a neighborhood that had been redlined might be completely redeveloped today. And so looking just at redlining might give you a weird mix of like cool new bougie gentrified neighborhoods and still declining but stable lower income neighborhoods. And then, of course, gentrification has been a hot topic in urban geography for decades, but there hasn't been as much work linking that to those historical processes before it. And so in between them, in particular, block busting, I've seen many fewer people are looking at that and associated like dynamics. So they're looking at before 1968, or they're looking at more contemporary, but they don't look in that middle of like, okay, what about the processes from 30, 40, 50 years ago that vastly and rapidly change neighborhoods, you know, within 10 years or less, and that might still be having impacts. So all that said, in the last year, I've been a part of 3 different teams, and actually the first 2 are building on those earlier studies. So Pearson is from the Speak to Your Health study, Rabinowitz and Felton are from the Healthy Minds at Work study, and then I have a new colleague, Danielle B. Moody, in Baltimore, also in Baltimore, but not at Hopkins. So each of these have been continuing the same line of reasoning, trying to move each of those different threads forward, but linking those historical racist or discriminatory housing practices more concretely and with more depth than I've done. So the first one leverages a twin registry at Michigan State, and we're going to be examining the role of historical structural racism, like all those things that I've been talking about, in shaping depression and anxiety and ADHD. And there's 12,000 families across Michigan. And again, so these next 3 are all just submitted grants, so we don't have any findings on them. But I wanted to share them to illustrate some of the breadth of the types of projects that will be connecting the historical structural racism to. And okay, so exposome is a kind of a jargony word, but the exposome is basically the idea of like the totality of the external and environmental impacts across one's life that could impact on their health. So it's a kind of a health ecological concept. So with the partly Michigan, partly Baltimore team, I'm also doing, so we're leveraging another longitudinal cohort called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. And in this one, we want to see if there's an added influence of the built environment, an added influence of, you know, living in formerly discriminated neighborhoods or disinvested neighborhoods on the way the brain evolves and grows. So in other words, as brains grow and evolve, does substance use impact that? Like, yes, we know there's impacts between those 2 things, but does living in a neighborhood that's worse off than another one increase your risk? So again, it's just adding that nuance to the study of topics that we already have some sense of. And that's a national study. And then and this one is the one that I co-submitted with my colleague. So I'm kind of a helper on the first two. And this one, my colleague Danielle and I submitted together as co-principal investigators. And again, we're going to be leveraging a cohort. So a cohort meaning over many years, they've revisited the same group of people and they have multiple data points. And this one's on aging. So this one I'm really interested in. It's back in Baltimore. Again, it's going to leverage some of the work I've done around mapping, redlining, and block busting and gentrification there. And so we're going to look at the connections between not just your current address, but we have historical addresses and we have a whole bunch of historical health records too. So we can see how people have been declining over time. So we'll be able to answer a question like, does living in a disinvested neighborhood, a block busted neighborhood, cause more rapid cognitive decline, dementia onset, physical frailty than living in a neighborhood that never changed, or a neighborhood that was redlined, but that has been stable over the last 50 years. So it can keep answering those questions of, you know, when did your neighborhood decline, if it declined, and for how long did it decline, and how does that impact different elements of aging? And so that the sample is just Baltimore. So it's nice, it's concrete. We'll be able to build a really strong geographic database of these structural racism variables. So as I start wrapping up, I took you through this whole flurry of projects, and they all dance around the idea that historical impacts on neighborhoods that we can't see anymore, redlining, block busting, predatory lending, what have you, all influence contemporary health outcomes because of how they shape the neighborhoods. It's not like someone personally experiences something. Of course, there are personal experiences, but we're looking at how those neighborhoods evolve, influence individual behaviors and health outcomes. So with an increasing evidence base on this topic, it's my hope that these insidious forms of structural racism are continuously called out and interrogated, and we make them more obvious, and we're able to use this data to work more earnestly for equitable urban redevelopment, like to eliminate the impact of these. And so, yes, you know, a lot of this work is still with psychologists, but I have colleagues across the board who are working on this. I was able to go to a couple of conferences last fall, and at two of the conferences, I completely serendipitously ran into people who were doing similar work. One with redlining and asthma, another one like on legacy impacts of redlining and other forms of structural racism. So there's other people out there. It's like super exciting, obviously, after 2 years of not going to conferences, like meeting someone who's doing the same stuff you are and being able to like talk stuff out and say, oh yeah, like I do this thing, and you know, you should look into that. And so I'm hoping that this becomes more and more of a topic of study and that we're able to leverage that. So a couple kind of short-term actions that I and my colleagues are doing and or hope others are doing, you know, describing disorder is one. So my colleague Deborah created a disorder tool called NIFTY, the Neighborhood Inventory for Environmental Typology. And we've done it in Flint a couple times. And basically it shows where are there places with relatively more litter, broken windows, broken down cars, unmowed grass, and you know, an absence of neighbors out, an absence of kids playing, stuff like that. So the relatively redder areas are the areas that scored lower on that metric. But what we're using that for is helping to advocate for intervention, so disorder reduction. The land bank here in Flint has a program called Clean and Green that they partner with community groups to maintain vacant lots. So those kinds of programs are growing too. I know there's programs like that in Camden and Youngstown and a few other communities. So trying to tackle those disordered environments and make them look more pleasant, right? And then there's also, Flint has a placemaking director. I know she's leaving soon, but I also know there's an interim person stepping into that role. And what they do is they activate these leftover places, right? So abandoned parking lots underutilized parks. They have block parties on random blocks. They'll get with block clubs and just have great big parties and bring in musicians and food vendors and everything. So it recreates the neighborliness that you miss when you lose your neighborhood store and school and your churches and all those things close. We're still learning about the impacts of all these activities. So I'm on a grant with some U of M folks called HEPTED. So if you've ever heard of CEPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, this idea, it takes the same idea, but it shifts it from crime prevention to health promotion. So how can we build spaces that are promoting of good health? What kinds of things might be more or less effective at doing that kind of thing? And so, yeah, so bringing attention to these inequalities and solutions. And I'm going to go on a 30-second rant real quick, and well, maybe 90-second rant, and talk about some of the longer term goals of this work. I mean, I know that I'm not alone in this, but it's still something that I feel like I need to say sometimes. Like, the goal of this is to advocate for more equitable urban development patterns. So the way we built our cities in the last 70 years has just been monstrous, right? We've plowed freeways through predominantly minority neighborhoods, thereby displacing them. Those freeways often or sometimes go to nowhere. They're underutilized today. I-475 is an example. The industry up the way, Buick City, that it was built to accommodate, there's practically nothing there on that site. It's one of America's largest brownfields, and yet the freeway still sits and may have hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars of reinvestment in the next 10 years just to keep it being a road, and for what purpose, right? And that's just one example of all of the patterns that we've deployed, this massive suburbanization of the population, which requires ever more infrastructure while isolating people socioeconomically, racially, to the point where Flint's poverty rate is probably 6 or 7 or 8 times higher than the poverty rate of the county, of the rest of Genesee County surrounding it. So, you know, we need to do better. We need to build more like denser communities, communities that can make use of active travel, public transportation systems, and start undoing some of the inequities that we built up for the last 70 years. I don't have a suggestion on this yet, but creating some kind of reparation system. And I think folks in Miami sued a bank down there for the legacy impacts of redlining on their neighborhoods. So this kind of thing, really, it's necessary. I mean, if you think about, you know, who were your grandparents, who were your parents, how much equity could they build in their home, if anything, and how did the provisions laid on their neighborhood impact their ability to do so, and how does that impact intergenerational wealth by either, you know, eliminating the ability to pass down wealth, or by causing younger generations to have to help take care of older generations because of the way they were discriminated against. So thinking about those kinds of things, either at the neighborhood level and incentivizing reinvestment in previously disinvested neighborhoods, or to individuals that were specifically harmed by those practices. And then, of course, there's things like revenue and tax-based sharing between rich and poor municipalities that Michigan had up until 2003, but that was restricted and was very much a contributing factor to the economic crisis that Flint found itself in when the state appointed an emergency manager. So in other words, sharing the pie, right? If we're all eating a pie together, and one of our communities is 4 times larger than another community, we're not all going to eat the same size of a slice of pie, right? Because the larger community needs to eat more pie, I guess. It's kind of a weird analogy, but the basic premise behind tax-based sharing was that bigger and more central municipalities got a little bit bigger slice of the pie because they provided countywide services, and they had more of the burden of social service provision in the county as a function of their population. And then the last thing is a pie in the sky idea that will probably never happen in Michigan, but consolidating municipalities. So when you do that, you can coordinate service provision, you can coordinate new development, you make decisions about, you know, what roads should be repaved or what schools should be opened in what neighborhoods based on all being in it together instead of just chopping up an urban region into little fiefdoms. So I think that's that's the end of my rant, but a couple research implications. I think it's about finding more evidence for using this data as evidence to target new interventions by the type of neighborhood, whether those are environmental design interventions or public health interventions. And then all this is speaking to the importance of incorporating these historical processes on how we define neighborhood context. It's not just about, is this a poor neighborhood or is it a wealthier neighborhood? It's about how was this neighborhood impacted by all of these other practices over decades. And then just one more time, recognition of the necessity of more equitable redevelopment patterns. We are going to keep rebuilding neighborhoods and houses over the next 50 years, even if our state population is kind of stagnant or declining. We're still going to need to build new housing, and we can choose to do it better, or we can choose to do the same thing we've been doing for the last 70 years. And then, of course, back kind of in the world of psychology and mental health, hopefully this gives more evidence for understanding how and when mental health conditions onset and become worse, and so on. So I shared the slides with Heather in case they're of interest to anyone, and so I won't belabor these, but these are just the citations to a few of the papers that I've either taken the lead on or been a contributing author on. And so that's just to show you exactly where I am in case you ever want to hunt me down, and a couple ways to contact me. Thanks.
That was fantastic, Rick. Heather, shall we take questions?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I have a question to start out with, if that works out. Yeah, I have a couple questions, actually. I wondered how old this field is, sort of the examination of the effects of structural racism on health outcomes. And then also, I think at the beginning you were talking about using a geographically weighted regression and then engaging with the community for the community to actually help determine the weights of those, like, and how that worked. Like, was this sort of focus groups, was this workshops, was these surveys? So yeah, two questions in one.
Sure. Yeah, so the field, I would say, well, so I'm a medical geographer, and by way of example, there's a medical geography symposium that I attend every couple of years, and that, I believe, was conceived in the late 80s or early 90s, and grew out of both the fact that GIS as a software was growing because computing was growing. A lot of it relies on computer mapping. So in that sense, like, this brand of the field is 30 years old, perhaps 35.
Okay.
But I think also just as like the evolution of, like, appreciating what's what. There certainly were people that were, social justice advocates and advocates for civil rights in the 60s and 70s. And I think it, for it to get, it seems like maybe like in the 80s is when you might say this kind of work really started. But that means that there's a lot of foundational work people were doing, and a lot of other domains people were exploring. I would say with respect to including redlining and other, like, overlaying things like that, maybe 10 or 15 years. I know, like, for example, Nancy Krieger is a really well-known researcher who's been doing this for at least 10 years. So yeah, I guess that's what I'd say for that. And then, like, the way we engaged the community with the mapping process was, it's called like a multi-criteria decision analysis. So it's a series of questions, and they're asked, if you're thinking about access to healthy food or access to parks, which would you say is relatively more important in predicting healthy behaviors? And so they could choose, like, well, they're the same. This one's a little bit more important. That one's a little bit more important. And they answer those questions for a whole bunch of variables, basically like a round robin sports tournament. And then I use linear algebra. It's like a simple kind of linear algebra, to calculate relative weights based on people's opinions about which variables they think are more important.
No, that makes sense. A lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Rick, I have a few questions.
Sure.
I liked your talk a lot. Of course, as a geographer, everything you said kind of resonated with me. I find it ironic that we're both dealing with psychologists now. I'm dealing with psychologists in terms of, access, mobility, travel behavior, how travel can be fun. So, although I don't know, I don't know the literature as well as you for sure, but couple of things that came up that might be relevant to your talk, your ideas. Residential self-selection. This is a common theory in geography. So this idea that people choose to live in these neighborhoods, and I think you mentioned resiliency a few times. I'm reading a book right now called Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment. So humans are just irrational. We 9 times out of 10 don't make the right decision, So, and this may be parlayed into residential self-selection because that theory is getting a lot of pushback these days as well. So I'm just curious how these sort of critical human elements are tied to what you're talking about, like where people live. If they have the means, they're going to choose to live in a neighborhood. And if that neighborhood has a lot of green space, so there's a lot of efficacy happening, even though the crime is really high and there's a lot of broken windows and, the lots are not clean and green, like you said, they become resilient and acclimated, right? So how do you account for that sort of acclimation factor, the resiliency factor at the human scale? And that changes over time as well. Everything, space and time is our bread and butter. So are you accounting, not to dive into the weeds, but how do you account for that human factor and space and time?
Yeah, I don't know that we have tried to tackle that yet. And I think that's a really good point. I think to some degree, we kind of would lean on that critical view that while there's some self-selection, a lot of people just kind of find themselves in neighborhoods where they grew up or where they can afford. I think one way of addressing it is like the behavioral economic approach, generally speaking, is saying, people don't always make the right decisions. They might think that they like this neighborhood because the schools are great or whatever, but then it means their kids can't bicycle anywhere because they live on a cul-de-sac and their kids are 8 and 10 and don't want to just bike in circles all the time. And so then they wind up not they think they move somewhere for a specific reason, but then they aren't able to capitalize on that. So, if we made if we made it easier for people to be active and healthy, then whatever element the self-selection process has could be, I guess, kind of smoothed out to some degree. But yeah, certainly in Flint, I think that the self-selection piece, just when I think of how different even neighborhoods within Flint are from each other, as compared to as a determining factor for where people live versus the relative housing cost in different neighborhoods. It's like for some people, it's like, oh, there's a house for 20 grand. Like I can afford that, or I can afford to rent this house that's $500 and I can't afford any of the new apartments downtown. And so people wind up where they can afford, and they can't think about that, about that aspect. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we haven't considered the, what do you call the added factor of, do people who are prone to not caring about impacts like that, prone to moving into, do people who care about disorder just move to the suburbs so they can live in a perfect neighborhood with perfectly mown lawns, versus do people who actually just value urban living and active travel gravitate more into other types of neighborhoods? Just because they're so different, right? Your average neighborhood within Flint, by and large, would be very different from an outer suburban neighborhood.
Right. Yeah, I guess I was curious how you capture that, or at least control for it in, some of these models. I'm sure that we both know pretty well. How do you capture that sort of human element, that residential self-selection, element, and the fact that humans just can't juggle more than like 7 criteria. I'm familiar with the multi-criteria decision analysis, and it's really a great way to suss that out. So I'm just curious, like, if that's in the back of your mind, the fact that humans are just noisy and they may not make the right decision, even if it's in front of them. It's like when a hurricane is bearing down on Tampa Bay, people will drive through a shelter, even though they know it's filled. Like they just drive on the highway, a tornado or hurricane's bearing down on them. So humans just, we under pressure are very poor decision makers. And so, I think this is maybe like sort of an underlying element of your research. At least I think so. Maybe it's not, but I was just curious what your comments are on that front.
Yeah. No, I think it's something that now I'm going to be thinking about and a book that I'm going to be looking into for sure.
And where I work. So if you want, if you need another collaborator amongst the 200 you already have, let me know.
Yeah. And I mean, it's I might be able to throw a baseball to your office from mine. So I'll wander down there.
For sure. I think we have one in the question too, just how can Flint residents support the work? If you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, at least with the work I've been involved with lately, we've been needing a lot of data collectors because we've been doing like built environment assessments. It's tough being a collaborator on some projects because a lot of projects require surveys, and I know quite well that there's always 1,000 surveys going on with Flint residents, but for the projects we're doing, a lot of them require participation in surveys and people to help recruit for them. So, I mean, there's that aspect. A lot of the connection with the HEPTED project I mentioned, the Health Promotion Through Environmental Design project, is connecting with neighborhood groups that are doing stuff like clean and green, but maybe different, whether it's some kind of beautification program or they're painting crosswalks or putting up signs to ask traffic to slow down, or like whatever kind of environmental intervention they're doing. We're trying to partner with as many of those groups as possible and at least kind of ask them what they're doing and get a lay of the land of everything beyond the clean and green that people are doing to make neighborhoods better. Because we want to be able to learn from those and what potential impacts those programs might have.
Well, I want to be
thank you.
sensitive to everyone. Yeah, thanks, Rick. So it's 2:04 according to my clock. Shall we wrap it up? I want to be sensitive to everyone's time, and I have a 2:30 another Zoom session. So Heather, what do you think? Good to go?
Yeah, thank everybody for coming, and especially Rick. It was great to have you here, and especially as an alum. We'd love to see this.
Yeah.
This is pretty awesome.
Thank you.
I owe you a big one. I'm so happy you said yes to this invitation.
Yeah,
thank you.
We'll run into you at the farmers market too, and it'll be great.
Yeah. Old school bumpkins. I love it. Okay, Dr. Sadler, don't be a stranger. It was great to see you. I'm really happy you gave us this talk today.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thanks again.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Have a good
Thank
day.
you. Bye.